Thanks, Alyssa. Good morning, all. It's great to be here with you today. My name is Stephanie Erdis. I'm the Associate Director. I did a couple of the workshops last week, so I'm glad to be back for our last workshop. You have made it through the live webinars. I also always like to take this opportunity to thank Alyssa for her hard work in putting this program together. It's a lot of logistics, it's a lot of time. And I know that she takes really good care of you all. So just a special thanks to her for both her presentation and for keeping this program running. So with that, we are going to start our presentation. And really, I would say that today's presentation is kind of like three mini presentations put into one. And the reason we do that is because today is largely about you. Up until now, we've really been talking about how you will be helping and serving sexual assault survivors. This final webinar is for sexual assault victim advocates. It focuses on preparing you and sustaining you for this work. Much like we did at the first webinar at the beginning of this series 2 weeks ago, we also like to take time at the beginning of this session to do a breathing and grounding exercise to focus us for this presentation and as an example of self-care. So I'm going to invite you all to relax your gaze and bring your attention to your inhales and your exhales, not forcing air in or out, just breathing. And bring that breath into balance so that your inhales are the same amount of time as your exhales. And relax into that rhythm of breath. And try, even for a moment, to let your thoughts go. We will take one deep breath together to the count of 4. And to begin, I invite everyone to exhale all the air in their lungs. And then inhale, filling your lungs to the count of 2, 3, 4. Pausing, holding that air in our lungs, and then exhaling, emptying our lungs to the count of 2, 3, 4. Take a few more deep breaths like this one on your own. While you are taking some deep breaths, we want to take this time to again acknowledge the survivors that are in our training today and the survivors we will help as advocates. Taking a moment here to appreciate yourself for being in this training this month and for all that you have learned and for all you will do for survivors in the future. We want to commit to gentle and honest conversation and dialogue as we learn together and talk about how to take care of ourselves as we do this work. If you haven't already, allow your breathing to return to normal with a gentle inhale and exhale. Enjoy a few more moments here. When you're ready, come out of the exercise by beginning to move your body, maybe wiggling your fingers and toes, blinking your eyes, shrugging your shoulders, or stretching your arms above your head. And then bring all of your focus and attention back to the training, and we'll begin the first mini lesson. So we're going to start today talking about professional ethics. And in this part of the training, we're going to define boundaries and ethics. What are these things? We're going to explore the reason and purpose for boundaries in our advocacy work. And then we're going to apply the ethical compass to our advocacy work. So I like to start out this training with these two quotes. The first is the first step in the evolution of ethics is a sense of solidarity with other human beings. And the second quote about ethics is action indeed is the sole medium of expression for ethics. And the reason I like to start with these quotes is because they talk about ethics as being both action and part of, and working with humans, like our action working with humans. So advocates, so for this training, we're really talking about the code, the rules, the guidelines that help us decide appropriate action to take when we're working with clients, when we're working with people in these vulnerable situations. So let's define boundaries. So boundaries are limits we set up for our own protection and for the protection of clients. They help build a supportive and healing environment. This is really important as we close out our training on victim advocacy. Boundaries are the structure that we use to make sure we're in these supportive environments. And my best pro tip for you is when it comes to boundaries, you really want to release your attachment to the survivor's choices. If you start having opinions or hoping that a survivor take a certain action or think a survivor should have a certain emotion, if you start saying the word should out loud or in your head, you are probably crossing a boundary. We have talked extensively about empowering survivors and giving them the resources and support they need to make the decisions they see best for them. So to empower them, we need to dissolve our own opinion of what is best for them. So I want you to write in the chat what we create boundaries around. So if you're a volunteer or if you're a new employee at one of our rape crisis centers or a place that serves sexual assault survivors, what are some boundaries? What are some of the things we create boundaries around? And I have a list as well, but I'm going to see how many you can come up with. And everyone always comes up with a couple that aren't on my list. So go ahead and drop in the chat. Oh, I'm going to back that up. I'm trying to, oh, there we go. I need to pull up the chat. Go ahead and drop in the chat. What are some things we put boundaries around in our own life, in our work life? Our organizations may have boundaries or rules or guidelines around certain ways that we conduct ourselves. Money, after hours call and contact, absolutely. Family, access to us, good one, Karina, like how people are able to contact us, how and when. Absolutely. So those are some of the top ones. I have some other ones that I'm going to put on the screen here. So some of the ones, topics of discussion, good one, Monica. Yeah, absolutely. What are you talking about with survivors? So the ones that I have put on the screen are personal relationships. So your relationship with the folks that you're working with, the survivors you're working with, should remain professional. Money, absolutely. That was one of the ones that was said. Communication, this was said in a couple of different ways, like how and when people can contact you, what medium they can use, like should they be using email? Do you have a cell phone that's provided by your organization? You know, are they contacting you through DMs? That's probably, something you want to draw a boundary around. You want to make sure that they're communicating with you in a way that's safe and comfortable for everyone. Social media and your interactions on social media, intimate relationships, physical interaction, alcohol and drugs, and confidentiality. And so the reason we create boundaries around these things is because people can manipulate them to exert power and control over someone. Sexual assault, as we have said, is about power and control. So when working with sexual assault survivors, we need to create boundaries around the things that can be used to exert power and control, or could be perceived to create power imbalance that could lead to control. And this is both for your protection, working with survivors, and survivors protection, working with advocates. So this is a full circle way of protecting folks, is to set up these really clear boundaries and to support and create that environment where folks are safe and they can, they can engage in the healing that they need. So let's talk about ethics. So this is the definition of ethics if you look it up. And it says ethics is a set of moral principles, a theory or a system of moral values. And frankly, I don't like this definition because I think it's really circular. It may be technically correct, but I don't think it's very useful for us as advocates. So I prefer to use this other definition when talking about advocate ethics. So this is a set of guidelines that help us make decisions about our work with survivors. So this comes from a couple of different places. It may come from some of your own values, the values of the organizations that you work with. It may come from some of the things that you have built boundaries around in your work, like what you need in order to be able to engage in this work. Ethics are not rules. They're not rules. They're not protocols. They're what fill in the gaps of what an organization, how an organization wants people to conduct themselves when working with survivors, or how you want to conduct yourself with working with survivors. So one of the ways I like to describe this is imagine like a big bucket. And these rocks are laws. These are the laws that you have to abide by when you're working with survivors. And then you dump in a bunch of other pebbles, right? Subjective, but there are some organizations that have really strong ethical codes. And this is, it's not going to say you need to do A, B, or C. It's going to give you guidelines on how to act in certain situations when the protocol or rules or laws may not be super clear. So I love to look at the professional ethics of a couple of different professions that we work with. So a great example is social work. This is a sample of the code of ethics that social workers use. They are often taught this in their social work classes right at the beginning of their career. And a lot of them can really recite some of this by heart. A lot of social workers kind of memorize this through their education and then throughout their work. And this makes perfect sense because we're talking about boundaries and ethics and keeping ourselves and our clients safe. And social workers deal with highly sensitive areas: substance abuse, child welfare, sexual assault, mental health. It's important for them to have a strong and clear set of ethics to guide their work. So you can see on the screen, I'm not going to read all of them, some of their ethical code. So things like the primary goal is to help people in need and to address problems. They are to respect the inherent dignity and worth of people. They're to behave in a trustworthy manner. They're to challenge social injustice. And this is an important part of their code of ethics because they may be challenging that code of injustice in the systems that they work in. And so to know that that is part of your professional ethics has a degree of protection. Some other examples are law, medicine, clinical professional counselors, and we'll look at the Department of Defense too. They have a code of ethics. So, and it makes sense that these folks would have strong codes of ethics professional ethics across their profession because they're working with folks in vulnerable situations, and these ethics are used to create that protective environment. So here's some more ethics from the Board of Maryland Social Work that they like us to share with you. So maintaining documentation, make the free of service clear, and maintain adequate and accurate financial records. So not only are these ethics talking about your interactions with clients, they're also talking about the way you conduct business. So the Department of Defense has a great ethical code for military victim assistance providers. So this talks about the relationship that victim advocates in the military have with their clients. And similar to social work, you'll see they also talk about recognizing the interests of the client and empowering the client, respecting and taking steps to protect their civil and legal rights, responding compassionately. These are some important things to have in writing for these folks that are doing this work. So here are a couple more: remaining committed to their own professional education. So CEUs are part of their code of ethics, and not using their personal social media platforms to interact with clients. And this is written right into their ethical code at the Department of Defense. So those are some solid examples as we are looking at what ethics and our advocacy look like. So if you don't have a set of professional ethics, so you're not a social worker or you're not a victim advocate for the Department of Defense or in the military, here are some ways to think about your advocate ethics as you begin your work or continue your work with survivors. So you want to focus on the survivor's wishes. You want to advocate for the survivor. That is your sole work with them. You may help the survivor with a variety of issues. That could be referring them to other resources. That could be doing some research and figuring out the best folks that can help them. Each survivor's situation is different, so we want to be open to the issues that they're experiencing and be helpful in providing what they need to resolve those issues. Honesty, easy to understand and easy to understand why it would be part of our ethics. You want to stay within the realm of your responsibility. So you don't want to practice law or counseling if that is not your role. If you are an advocate, you don't want to engage in that, but you can connect folks to counselors or to attorneys if that is what they need. And you want to respect the boundaries of the survivor. That's always a huge, important part of our ethical work with advocates. So before we close out this section and do our little exercise around the ethical compass, I want to talk about why ethics is important. So sexual assault, domestic violence, gender-based violence, which we didn't even call it 50 years ago, that has its foundation in grassroots activism. These were volunteers. These were people associated with churches and community groups and schools and education institutions that were really moving this industry, moving this field and creating what we now know as prevention and response, sexual assault prevention and response. So a commitment to ethics helps give it legitimacy. It safeguards the reputation of our work. It protects the public from exploitation and abuse. And it furthers the responsibility and practice of our role. And I will tell you my experience as an advocate when I was doing direct service work. I was challenged more than once saying I was telling the survivor what to do, or I was influencing them, or I was manipulating the situation. And I was able to go back to my ethical work over and over and over again to prove that that was not the case. I was able to say, this is what we do in our office. This is how we work with clients. This is the information we provide. So ethics is important beyond keeping those boundaries and that workplace safe. It's also important in safeguarding the whole concept of sexual assault victim advocates. So we have a little activity for you. Instead of giving you a list of rules or guidelines about ethics, we want to provide you with one guiding principle to remember when making ethical decisions regarding your work with clients. It's impossible to come up with every scenario. And the second we try to give you a list of rules, there will be an exception. So, our ethical compass is a guide for you to make decisions. So, the question you want to ask yourself when making an ethical decision is, does this action upset the balance of power between myself or my agency and the client? Most ethical questions do not come up at a convenient time. It's not a time you can reach your supervisor. You may be in a hospital at 2 a.m. and have to make a decision. In the absence of having clear protocol or rules or a supervisor to rely on, this is the question you can ask yourself. So I'm going to read you a little scenario and I'm going to have you answer in the chat what you would do. So imagine that we are all out to dinner celebrating your birthday. We're at your favorite restaurant, enjoying lots of good food and treats and drinks and appetizers, all the things. And you know the server from your role as an advocate. They used your organization's services a little while ago, and you know how hard they worked to rebuild their life after their sexual assault. You spend about $37 on your dinner. What is an appropriate tip for the server? So go ahead and put in the chat what you would tip this server. This is not something that I actually made up. For those of you, especially working in smaller communities, it's very likely that you are going to run into the survivors that you help outside of work. You may see them at a grocery store. You may see them at your local library or a community event. They may work at your hair salon or your bank or your, does anyone even go to a bank anymore in person? Probably not. So you can scratch that off your list. Or they may work at a restaurant you go to or a coffee shop you go to. They may frequent those places. So thinking about your ethical interactions with those folks outside of your work environment and your advocacy is a good idea. So let's see in the chat what people have wrote. Oh, you guys have great answers. So I'm seeing $10, I'm seeing $8, 20 to 30%, like I would do for anyone else. What you would tip any server, 20%, between 20 and 25. All of these answers are correct. So, you know, if you have a $37 meal and you normally tip 15 to even 20, 25%, that's perfect. If you want to throw in an extra dollar, round it up to $10, that's going to be fine. That person is not going to look at the situation and be like, oh, I owe this person something. This is not going to upset the balance of power. Now, you may have a $50 or $100 bill in your pocket, and you're just going to throw the $100 bill, keep the change. That may look to that person, even if that doesn't change the power for you, that may look to that person as a disruption in the balance of power, that they would now owe you or your organization something. So you're not just looking at this from your perspective, but from the survivor's perspective as well. So acknowledging the power differential is really what you are also considering here. So remember the hierarchy of decision making when you are talking about ethics. First, you want to look to your policies of your agency. Second, you want to look to your supervisor. And if those aren't available, you have this available to you, this compass of, does this action upset the balance of power between myself, my organization, and the client or the survivor? So excellent work on this. I am now going to turn it over to Alyssa for the second part of today's presentation.
Thank you. So switching gears here a little bit, now we're going to talk about vicarious trauma. Next slide. So the learning objectives for this part of the presentation are to understand the terminology of vicarious trauma, compare and contrast vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout, and identify warning signs of vicarious trauma and burnout. Next slide. So what is vicarious trauma? If we break this down, vicarious means experiencing or taking on someone else's experiences through empathy. And trauma, as we've described before, is a deeply distressing or disturbing event. So taken together, vicarious trauma is the emotional residue of exposure that those have from interacting with people as they're hearing stories of trauma and become witnesses to the pain, fear, and terror the trauma survivors have endured. Now, before moving on, if we could all put in the chat, what are some examples of professionals who may be at risk of experiencing vicarious trauma? So people who may not have experienced the trauma directly, but so I see social workers as an example. Yep. Hospital-based advocates, nurses, EMTs, law enforcement. Yep. And victim services. Yeah, so those are all great examples of professionals who may experience vicarious trauma. Next slide. So some of you already have already covered these. A few more are educators, it could be caretakers, legal services staff or lawyers. So legal advocates would be included here. And again, therapists and social workers, basically anyone, I see in the chat, paralegal specialist for homicide and military. Yes, military is another one as well. Basically anyone who interacts with people who experience a trauma and have some knowledge of what the traumatic experience was is at risk of experiencing vicarious trauma. Next slide. So some signs that we may be experiencing vicarious trauma include physical and psychological symptoms, often associated with the trauma. This is also referred to as secondary traumatic stress. I want to note that secondary traumatic stress is a form of vicarious traumatization, and it occurs when we get symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. Secondary traumatic stress symptoms may include re-experiencing a survivor's trauma, avoiding reminders of the trauma, or persistent psychological arousal. Some other signs of experiencing vicarious trauma include emotional attachment to a survivor's decisions, over identifying with a survivor's story, difficulty in maintaining professional boundaries, and being overly preoccupied with thoughts of the survivor outside of the workplace. Next slide. So according to a 2019 study of social workers who worked directly with clients that experienced trauma, the study found that 80% of survey respondents reported meeting diagnostic criteria for at least one of the 3 secondary traumatic stress symptom clusters. So to break down what these clusters are, the first symptom cluster is intrusive symptoms. These include intrusive thoughts about clients, disturbing dreams about clients, a sense of reliving a client's traumatic experience, and experiencing psychological or physiological reactions. So that's intrusive symptoms. The second symptom cluster is avoidance symptoms. So these are things like avoiding the client, avoiding people, places, or things that reminds the person of the client or the traumatic experience, an inability to recall client information, diminished activity level, and a detachment from others or emotional numbing. The third symptom cluster is arousal symptoms. Arousal symptoms include things like difficulty sleeping, irritability, difficulty concentrating, hypervigilance, and being easily startled. So we have intrusive symptoms, avoidance symptoms, and arousal symptoms. So going back to that study with the 80%, 31% of the survey respondents reported experiencing secondary traumatic stress due to directly working with a client who experienced trauma. And of those who worked directly with traumatized clients, 40.35% reported having trouble sleeping as a result of their work. 39.47% reported having trouble concentrating. 37.72% reported wanting to avoid working with some clients. And 15.79% reported reliving traumatic experiences that were experienced by their clients. Next slide. So switching gears here a little bit, vicarious trauma is similar to compassion fatigue. Some of you may have already heard of what compassion fatigue is, but the definitions of the two are a little bit different. So remember, vicarious trauma is that emotional residue as a result of being indirectly exposed to a traumatic event. Compassion fatigue is empathetic strain and general exhaustion resulting from caring for people in distress. So we see this commonality between the two, that both of them are a result of caring for people in distress or caring for people who experienced a traumatic event. Some signs of compassion fatigue are emotional detachment and numbness, social withdrawal, intrusive negative thoughts, and secretive self-medication. Next slide. So some long-term consequences of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and prolonged stress are that it may result in burnouts. Next slide. Burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, and this is caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It occurs when we feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet constant demands. Some signs that we may be experiencing burnout include poor attitude towards coworkers, our agency, or clients. It can be losing our why or our sense of purpose for why we're doing this work, continued exhaustion, and a decreased performance and productivity. Next slide. So every person that we encounter is likely to have experienced either direct or indirect exposure to trauma in their lifetime. So a trauma-informed practice should not end with how clients are served. Professionals in the victim services field can also benefit from a trauma-informed practice in their place of work. And agencies should prioritize policies to help prevent and address vicarious trauma and burnout in the workplace. Next slide. So if your workplace is not currently using trauma-informed practice to address vicarious trauma and burnout, advocate for it. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about self-care. I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie. Next slide.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. So I would say of all of the presentations that we do at MCASA, the last part of this presentation is one of my favorite. I love this part of the presentation because it allows us to all learn from each other and really talk about self-care in a holistic way. So for the remainder of our time together, we are going to explain self-care. What is this? And we're going to go a little deeper than what you might have seen on TikTok and Instagram. Not that I don't love those places for self-care tips, but we're going to talk about how this specifically applies to you as an advocate. We're going to analyze why we don't practice self-care. We're going to describe the consequences of poor self-care, have a little confession time if people want to share. And we're going to classify and evaluate self-care strategies and create a personal self-care plan. Now, the next part of this, we are going to ask you to drop some stuff in the chat, and give us some information on what you do for self-care. But I want to stay right up front. This is at your own at your own comfort level. Please share if you want to, if you want to engage, if you want to talk about self-care, great. If you don't and you want to keep self-care to yourself, that's also totally fine. So let's get started by really talking about and defining what self-care is. So the simple definition is intentional activities and practices meant to reduce stress and maintain physical, psychological, and emotional health. So some of this is fun, when we talk about self-care, but some of it is things that might not be as fun, but they really support your health. So let's break that down. One of the things that we like to talk about right up front when we're talking about self-care is the difference between self-care and self-soothing. So you often hear the term self-soothing as part of infant or child development. So babies sleeping through the night or waking up but not crying out. We carry self-care techniques throughout our lives, and they grow and change as we grow and change. So self-soothing techniques are typically things we like to do. Yoga, golf, walking around the block, binge watching TV, scrolling or posting on social media, deep breathing, drinking a beer or glass of wine on a stressful day, eating a piece of dark chocolate, or I'll be honest with you, for me, it's eating any piece of chocolate feels like self-soothing. So self-soothing is absolutely part of self-care. It helps us manage stress. It can help us to be happier or more relaxed, especially in the moment. But self-care goes beyond making ourselves feel better and is really about taking care of ourselves and building our resilience. So an example from my own life. I do yoga on a regular basis. I read about yoga. I listen to yoga podcasts. Like, I am a real fan of this practice for self-care. This is self-soothing for me. It helps me in the moment, but it's also self-care because it helps with my long-term health as well. It's good. It's a healthy thing for me to do. However, I also, in the summer, when we're a little slower, make a lot of doctor's appointments and a lot of scheduled scans and tests. This is not really soothing for me. It's not really relaxing for me to go to the dermatologist or to get my blood drawn to check my blood levels or whatever at the doctor's. But the practice of taking care of your health through medicine can help you. That is part of self-care, and that can help sustain you and create resilience. So self-soothing techniques can go against our strategies for taking care of ourselves. So for example, baking delicious treats and eating them might be self-soothing. And I encourage some of that if you like to do that. But if you eat too many of those sugary treats, it could go against your long-term self-care. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's important to see the difference between what is a self-soothing activity and what is a self-care activity, where the overlaps are and where the imbalances can occur. So let's talk about why we don't practice self-care. So I'm going to have you put in the chat for you, or maybe you've observed this of other people, why you don't practice self-care. Again, share at your comfort level. We're not insisting on this, but if you want to share ways that why you don't practice self-care, that'll help advance our conversation if you would like to be part of that. And I put this quote up here from Audre Lorde because I think it really encapsulates self-care and its importance, particularly for advocates. So she says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. So having done advocacy work for a decade and a half, I will tell you it's exhausting. And some of you in this training have probably also done work or similar work for a while, and you understand that it can be really draining. And so the better we are at taking care of ourselves, the longer and more powerful we can be in this work. So the world will run you down. And especially if you are trying to challenge social norms, if you are working with folks that have been victims or survivors of sexual assault or other types of abuse. So taking care of ourselves is part of our work. So keep that in mind as we go through this. And everybody has moments of not practicing self-care. So let's look to see if anyone shared anything in the chat. They take care of family or others first. Absolutely. No time or financial capacity. Thank you so much for bringing this up. I'm going to talk about this in a second. Social or cultural pressure. Absolutely. I've been seeing a lot on my own social media, um, like not emphasize the hustle culture and like really elevate a slowdown culture. And I very, very much love that concept, but I have not embodied it. So I totally understand that. Um, so a lot of other needs first, feeling selfish or not making it a priority, lack of time. Absolutely. Lack of time is coming up a lot here. And that is really, I think that that is really one of the number ones. Um, oh, Rest is Resistance is a fantastic book on this. Oh, Brandy, thanks for bringing that up. Rest is Resistance. So any other book recommendations or resource recommendations, please put them in the chat. So these are the reasons that we came up with. And it is a lot of what you all said, feeling selfish, too many other people to take care of, not enough money, and too busy. And what I want to say about the money thing, so whoever put that in the chat, thank you. So one of the things that I noticed, particularly in and around COVID, and now that we are hopefully kind of in a different COVID era, it's not gone away, but we have, managed some of that in a way that we're looking at it differently. Really, self-care can be really expensive. I mean, you can go on a spa weekend, you can, spend money on a massage or something like that, and that can really add up, but it doesn't have to be expensive. You can do a lot of self-care techniques, and we're going to talk about them, and hopefully some of you will share your self-care techniques that are really inexpensive or free. So there's this perception that it costs a lot of money because it can, but it doesn't always have to. So keep that in mind as well. So let's talk about the consequences of self-care. And there's a bit of a confession part in this if folks want to take part in that. So we pay a price if we're not practicing good self-care, or we're letting our self-care and our self-soothing get really out of balance. And for many of us, we know when we're not practicing good self-care. We're going to have a little confession time. So if you want to, again, share at your own comfort level. Put in the chat when you know you aren't practicing good self-care. And while you're doing that, I will tell you some of the ways my body tells me when I'm not practicing good self-care. So the two big indicators for me are my eyes will start to twitch. Too much screen time, too much reviewing or writing grants, too much spending time after that just scrolling on my phone. My eyes will start to twitch pretty badly. It's not just annoying. It really kind of can impact my work. The other thing I do is I clench my teeth at night and I have really bad nightmares. So if I'm not sleeping well, if I'm waking up with my jaw hurting, I know that I'm not practicing good self-care and the stress is really starting to impact my body. So there are I could give you a list of 100 things that, of 100 ways I know that I'm not practicing good self-care, but I also want to hear from you all as well. I'm hearing other people talk about inability to fall asleep, um, pain in my heart. Oh, yes. When our hearts hurt physically, but also sometimes, like just in our emotions as well. That's a great example. Thanks for sharing that. Getting sick or my body forcing me to rest. I've heard that from lots of caregivers. If you don't rest when you need it, your body will force you to do that. Dehydration, I love this one. Stomach pains, snappy or missing work. I love the dehydration one because my husband has often said I should wear one of those like camel packs at work because that will happen to me. I won't drink anything all day long. And then I will be super dehydrated because I just haven't taken the breaks I've needed. I'm yet to come to a point where I'm going to wear that camel pack where I can just sip water all day like I'm on a hike, but who knows? Maybe it will come to that. Irritability, stomach issues, insomnia, um, oh, how attentive they are to their plants is always a good indicator for me. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's such a sweet one. If you're not paying attention to your cats or your pets, or you don't feel like you're spending enough time with your family, that absolutely can be an indicator. Excellent. Thank you all for sharing these. There, keep them coming in the chat, so folks feel free to read that as we go through this. You all covered most of this, but this is just a quick slide to talk about the different areas of your life that can be impacted. So it can be your personal life, your workplace, it can be your personal health. All of those areas can be impacted by self-care. So if you're not practicing good self-care, you may have low self-esteem or feel isolated or be struggling with some of your relationships inside and outside of work. We did a lot of health ones in the chat. So fatigue, headaches, weight loss or gain, sleep disturbances, a weakened immune system, just total exhaustion. All of those things can come up when we're not practicing good self-care. And in the workplace, Alyssa touched on some of this in her presentation, but lack of motivation, having a hard time focusing, missing work, being late, just a poor overall morale. All of those things can be impacted when we're not practicing good self-care. So I want you to think about for this next section, we're going to talk about different self-care and self-soothing techniques. So don't put them in the chat yet. We will tell you when and what we're going to talk about, because we're going to break down the self-care wheel. But think about what some of your techniques are that you may want to be or may be willing to share with the group. And while we do that, Alyssa's going to talk a little bit more about some self-care strategies.
All right. So for self-care strategies, we like to think of this as the 3R approach. So the first thing is you want to be recognizing or watching for warning signs of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, or burnouts. Then you want to reverse or undo the damage. So doing this by managing the stress and seeking support. And finally, you want to build your resilience to the stress by taking care of your physical and emotional well-being and health. And we'll do this when we talk in the next couple of slides about the self-care wheel. Next slide. So thinking in terms of self-care, it's helpful, it may be helpful, to build a self-care action plan. I want to note here that self-care is something that can be done as a preventative mechanism. So trying to prevent yourself from experiencing burnout or prevent yourself from experiencing compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. But it also can be something that's done in like an emergency, like you've already started experiencing these symptoms and now you need to halt them or you need to stop them in place. You want to reverse them now. So you can have two different kinds of self-care action plans. When you're building your self-care action plan, you want to start with a problem. So identifying if you are experiencing any of those symptoms we've talked about, identify what those are. Or if you're building this as a maintenance self-care plan, just identify that as that's what you're doing. You're building this to be preventative. The next part here is you want to build your goal. So these are things like that are very broad, like a broad vision for yourself of how you're going to address the problem. For example, a goal could be to reduce the risk of burnout or compassion fatigue. Or maybe your goal is to increase self-care protective factors to prevent risk of burnout. So those are very broad goals or broad visions to address the problem. The strategy will help you achieve the goal. So these are a little bit more specific than the goal, but still a little bit broad that you can fit multiple activities under them. So for example, let's say your goal was to increase protective factors for self-care. A strategy may be to increase your physical wellness, or maybe you're increasing your emotional wellness. So that's still broad enough that we can fit multiple techniques or activities under it, but it's also specific enough that it fits under your goal. And then the final step is to establish your specific techniques or activities, what works, what doesn't, to address your strategy. So again, let's say your strategy was to increase your physical wellness. Maybe your technique is you're going to go for a 20-minute jog 3 times a week, or maybe you're going to lift weights at the gym once a week. So those are specific, they are measurable. You can see if it's working, if it's not working, if you're actually doing it, if it's adding more stress to your plate, then maybe you don't want to do that. Try something else. The thing with the self-care action plan is that it's supposed to be helpful to you. So it's like this living, breathing document where you can adjust it or edit it, whatever works best for you, because the last thing we want to do is add more stress to your plate. Next slide. All right, so for the remainder of the presentation, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of these categories of the self-care wheel. These categories are physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, and professional. Next slide. So starting off with physical, and feel free to put in the chat some examples of physical self-care. And I will name a few as well. I think, Stephanie, if you can hit the slide one more time to make the full appear. Yep, there we go. So some examples here include eating a balanced diet. It could be drinking water. As Stephanie mentioned, that's a really important aspect of self-care. Getting enough sleep, getting that regular medical care, pampering yourself. So those are just to name a few. I'm going to take a look at the chat here. We have someone that dances. Yes, that's a great example of physical self-care. Any activity, movement, getting outside, breath work, breathing. Yes. For someone, it is being in their hot tub after work. That sounds amazing. They said nothing relaxes me like those water jets. We also have people who lift weights. Yes, so these are all great examples of physical self-care. And some of you have listed some other ones. Pilates, sauna, steam room. Yep. Yeah. Another thing that I want to note before we move on is the self-care categories are not rigid. Like it's not just physical self-care or just emotional or just psychological, which we'll get into, but there's a lot of overlap in these. So some of these in the chat are, I can already see some overlap, and we'll go into those on the next couple of slides. I'm gonna hand it back to you now, Stephanie.
Great, thanks. These are great examples of physical self-care. So let's talk about psychological self-care. And the way I like to define this is what are we doing to take care of our brain? So physical self-care, we're really, that's really kind of about taking care of our physical body. But what are we doing to take care of our brain? So put that in the chat as well. And like Alyssa said, there's a lot of overlap. So, I saw someone put in that they live near a state park. That probably walking in the state park, enjoying that nature, getting that fresh air, that probably covers 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 or 6 pie slices of the self-care wheel. So keep that in mind too. One action could be a lot of that. So some of the ones we came up with are finding a creative outlet, participating in therapy, practicing mindfulness and positive thinking, and taking time for yourself. So someone put in the chat, like silence, like no TV, no radio, no streaming, no music, just a couple moments of silence. They did not define how much silence. It could be an hour for them. It could be a little bit, but I really loved that one for psychological self-care, like just silence for a while. Reading, absolutely. Reading, we get writing sometimes as well. So other things that you want to put in the chat that might help with your psychological self-care. So taking care of your brain. I think, one of the things that we sometimes forget during the day, just like we forget to drink water during the day, I think getting up, taking a brief walk around your house or your office, or your neighborhood if that's possible. I think that that can really help pull you out of give your brain a little break, I guess is the best way to say that. Someone put coloring or crossword puzzles. Absolutely. Those are ways to just relax your brain, give you some psychological self-care. I'm going to turn it back over to Alyssa to talk about emotional self-care and my favorite slide of all MCASA training slides.
Thank you, Steph. So for emotional self-care, these are things that are taking care of your heart. So on the previous slide, it was your mind. Now it's about your heart and your feelings. So some examples of emotional self-care are spending time with friends, family, or pets. And feel free again to put some things in the chat. Another example is finding a hobby that makes you happy, recognizing your hard work, of course, giving yourself credit for all things that you deserve credit for, watching a funny movie or a TV show, and releasing your emotions. And I also want to note here on the slide, these are actually our cats. We love our cats at MCASA. My cat is the one in the bottom corner, that's Coda. And we often talk about how our cats are perfect examples of practicing self-care. I mean, sleeping whenever they want to, and playing or eating or whatever they want to do, they pretty much do it. I don't know, Stephanie, if you want to talk about your cat at all.
Oh, sure. Always, always I want to talk about my cat. So I'll try to keep it brief. My cat is the orange striped cat in the top here. His name is Cinco. It's just an old man cat, and he is unapologetic about his self-care. When he wants to cuddle, he cuddles. When he wants a treat, he begs for a treat. He likes to sit outside and enjoy the sun on his face. So yeah, really great example of self-care. And really, I think for, everyone in our family, he offers a lot of comfort and, emotional support when we are really needing it. He's some of the rest of you may have this too. He's a purr machine. Like his purr sounds like a mower. It's like really powerful, and that's really soothing to all of us.
Yeah, definitely. I can relate to that with my cat. So let's take a look here at the chat for some emotional self-care examples. I see gardening. Yes, definitely. And I think that also overlaps with psychological self-care too in some ways. And it could be physical too. Listening to gospel music. Yes. Let's see. Someone said spending at least one daily hour resting for their mind and themselves, reading a book, watching a good movie, laughing a lot, walking their dog, playing with their daughter, being physically affectionate with beloved people. Yes, those are all great examples. And someone else said crossword puzzles or coloring. We have writing songs or poems, playing my guitar, playing an instrument. Yeah, these are all really great examples of emotional self-care. Back to you, Stephanie.
Great. So the next one we're going to talk about is spiritual self-care. And what you just put in for emotional self-care leads right into some of the things we can do for our spiritual self-care. So the folks that talked about playing instruments or listening to gospel music, absolutely. And spiritual self-care does not have to be related to a religion, but it can be. So if you have a religion that you practice, there's probably a lot of spiritual self-care in some of the traditions and ways that you practice that. If you don't have a traditional religious practice, there are other ways to infuse spiritual self-care into your self-care plan. So enjoying nature and the natural beauty of life. So going back to that person that talked about walking around their state park, finding a spiritual community if that is important to you, meditating or mindfulness, practicing self-reflection. So that could include journaling or just taking some time to rest and think, volunteering for a cause that is outside the causes that we work for. So, maybe you really are into, pet adoption, so volunteering for something like that. Or for those that like gardening, maybe there's a community garden to volunteer at. Or if you like singing, maybe there's a choir to sing in. So volunteering for a cause that you find fulfilling and really, kind of a spiritual way can be helpful in adding in spiritual work, as adding in spiritual self-care. The one that's not on here but could go with meditating is praying as well, could be part of spiritual self-care if that's part of your practice. So feel free to drop in the chat anything that you want to include in spiritual self-care. I think that we already have a bunch of folks that have put stuff that classifies into this category as well. So I will send it back over to Alyssa to talk about personal self-care.
Thanks. So personal self-care, these are some things that we often don't think about when we talk about self-care, but they are just as important. For example, creating a budget. And as we've seen in the chat, you may not need to maintain a budget for maybe going outside for a walk. But some of these other activities that we like to do, whether that's for self-care or self-soothing purposes, or just wanting to maintain an overall financial wellness, creating a budget or maintaining a budget is really important for that. And then some other personal self-care includes developing a skill. So maybe that's learning to play a new instrument, or learning a new language, or developing some other hobby. It can also getting organized can be an example. Maybe doing a deep clean of your office or your house, and making time. I see power clean. Yes, right along those lines. Making time for building relationships. I know that was talked about also in the chat earlier. And setting short and long-term goals. I see some other personal self-care. Someone has put massages. Yeah, that's another example. Does anyone else have any examples of personal self-care? Things that maybe you do or things that you want to do? Maybe something you want to experiment with on your self-care action plan? Nails and hair. Yep, getting those things done. Pampering yourself.
Great
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
I was talking to my sister last night and she gave an example here. She had a friend visiting midweek. She was coming in for business, stayed with my sister on a Tuesday night. So my sister spent all Monday, she called it the panic clean, right? So she did all this like cleaning and organizing to get her apartment ready. And she's like, I don't have anything to do this weekend. She was like, I can just relax. So though that stuff does not seem fun or soothing when it's done, it can really feel good. So that was her example from last night. I'm seeing people really love the water. I'm seeing boat, pool, sauna again. This is
Yeah.
amazing. Perfect.
2 to 3 mini vacations a year. Yeah, that's awesome. Going to bed earlier. Yes, I love that one. I went to bed so early last night. It was amazing. Um, small road trips. Yeah, these are all awesome. Making someone laugh. Yes. Yeah, you all are really great at this. Awesome.
Excellent. Well, some of these also lead right into the professional self-care as well. And this one is really close to, the work that I do at MCASA because I'm a supervisor. So I supervise a couple of different folks. And so I think that this professional self-care is really important. I don't think it feels indulgent or should feel indulgent because this is what sustains you to do this work for longer, and not longer in the day or the week, but just to be in the field for more weeks, months, or years. So chatting with a coworker, and I love someone putting in the chat, making someone laugh, making your coworkers laugh. Absolutely. Doing breath exercises during your workday, going for a walk or getting up from your desk, planning for professional development. So planning for and asking for professional development, setting reachable goals, and making sure that you're asking for the support you might need from a supervisor or other staff member to help reach those goals. Stretching at your desk. Please, please, this last one is super important. Take your sick days and your vacation days. Those are not a gift from your organization. You have earned those days. And Alyssa has heard me talk about MCASA taking vacation days over and over and over again. For 3 or 4 months, as we get to the end of our fiscal year, I bring up in every staff meeting, take your days, talk to your supervisors, get that time off. And if folks aren't feeling well, we want them to have the time to rest and recuperate and come back to work feeling strong. So take those sick days, take those vacation days, and take time for your lunch. This is something that at MCASA is sacred. We really try to make sure that people have that hour in their day, midday. We don't, people can't take their lunch break at MCASA at the beginning or end of the day. So it's not starting late or ending early. They can do other things to do that, to flex their time. But we have this like time period during the day where we really want people to be able to take that break, to eat, to watch TV, to walk around the block, to take their dog out, to go pick some flowers, whatever they want to do. That's part of how we support self-care, is to really, really protect that lunch break. Do we always get to take an hour worth of lunch? No, but do we get to take it most days more than any other place I've worked at? I will tell you that. So those things and those breaks are really important throughout your workday. So some other folks have some ideas too. Taking breaks, always taking lunch outside of the office. Oh, you have a picnic table. Oh, that's a great idea. So weather permitting, you can be outside. So you're combining a couple different areas of self-care there. Um, I find that reading can take my mind off of things and provide a sort of escape. So sometimes I like to read during lunch. Oh my gosh, Alexis, you have spoken to my heart. I listen to audiobooks during my lunch break and walk around my block. And I'm almost done with one, so I'm going to finish it today. So I'm really excited after this. I get to finish my audiobook at lunch. So I think things like that are really important. So, I really think that, what we get joy in, even if it's, a small amount of joy that's just for us in our day, can be really helpful for us to sustain this work. So this next slide, I love the last slide in talking about work. Um, but oh, someone put that they take a nap during lunch. I also love this. I think that I had never heard of this until I worked at MCASA, and one of my colleagues is like, sometimes I just need to like shut my eyes for 20 minutes. And I think that that is a great use of time for a lunch break or a break, is just to kind of, take a rest, take a break. So the last slide that I have when we're talking about self-care is really cautioning about those imbalances between self-soothing and self-care. So this feels very lectury to me, and that's not how I want it to feel. I just want folks to think about how their self-care wheel will stay in balance. So things that can throw it out of balance are, and I'm guilty of some of these things as well. So excess caffeine intake can kind of throw your self-care out of whack. Same thing with indulging in unhealthy foods too often, or excessive intake of alcohol, or use of illegal drugs. All of those things can throw your self-care out of balance. Sure, they may feel self-soothing, but eventually they're not. Eventually they're gonna make you they could make you not feel great and work against your self-care. And what I will tell you, there's no subscription here that we are providing. We're not saying, 4 cups of coffee a day is bad news, or you shouldn't have coffee and Coke. I don't care. This is all up to you. You know what feels uncomfortable for you. So think about those things as you are planning out your self-care wheel. The other one is excuses for certain behaviors at work. So I've seen this sometimes in our field when someone's, in a really intense situation with a client, or they spent all night at the hospital and they're just really not taking the time that they need to recover from that. When Alyssa was talking about vicarious trauma and burnout, one of the signs of that is like, well, I treated this person badly, or I snapped at this person, or I was late, or I fell asleep at my desk because I wasn't practicing good self-care. And being in a supportive environment where you can take care of yourself is really important. So a couple things to think about. And as I turn it over to Alyssa, what I will say is we went through the self-care wheel, and she's going to talk a little bit more about it. But what we have noticed when we've done this in person is that everyone has great self-care techniques for some of these high pieces, but some of them are a little out, can be a little bit less. And so to do this exercise can help you figure out where your deficincies are. So Alyssa, I hope I didn't steal too much of your thunder there. So I
No,
will
you're
I will
good.
send it over to you to close us out.
Thank you. So yes, so self-care wheels are great when you're thinking about your self-care action plan, or if you want to use this as your action plan. I do want to say that you will be receiving a follow-up email with a copy of a blank self-care wheel. So you can use that, jot down some ideas from the chat, experiment with new ideas. But really, you want to be thinking about, what are you already doing? Of course, give yourself credit for that because that's awesome. And then think about what else can you be doing? What kind of things do you want to try out? What can you be doing in the next 7 days or the next month or the next year to improve on your self-care? And maybe this is, for that preventative self-care, or maybe it is things you're going to do right after you've experienced some symptoms or signs of vicarious trauma. So thinking about both the preventative, long-term maintenance self-care, and then also that emergency self-care. Next slide. So that concludes our final training session for this series. This is our contact information. And again, I'll be sending out a follow-up email either today or tomorrow with a copy of today's recording, PowerPoint slides, the blank self-care wheel, and the anonymous evaluation form. So I've put the anonymous evaluation form into the chat. Again, we greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. And if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll gain access to our certificate request form. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or respond to the follow-up email when it comes. So thank you again so much for joining us for today's session. And if you've been here for the other sessions as well, thank you for coming to those. It was great to chat with everyone in the chat and hear your answers to all of our questions. And it was great to see the engagement from everyone. We hope you have a fantastic rest of your day and an awesome weekend. Thank you.